Welcome to the second Dank Pod-Stash Debates. I'm non-voting Nick, and I have here with me Andrew Gouff and Dustin Menssen. Today we're talking about whether or not a Boogaloo is a principled anarchist stand, whether or not taking the action of Boogaloo holds up to anarchist principles. And we got Andrew arguing for that they do, and Dustin against. And we're going to start out. We did a quick decider to see who has the opening statement, the first opening statement, and that's going to be Andrew. And let me lay it out real quick. The time constraints for this, for everybody watching, we got 5 minutes per participant for the opening statements. I'll be presenting points for both participants to debate, and they have 5 minutes to either field the question, or if they're coming in after someone's fielded the question, they can either field it or issue a rebuttal. And we're going to go through a few different points that I've come up with and then go to closing statements and try to keep it to right about an hour. So without further ado, Andrew, opening statement.
Now, in recent days more than ever before, we have seen the state of the world in which we live. In order to beg and plead for government, that great fiction born of coercion and extortion to which we find ourselves having become far too accustomed, to refrain from the shameless usurpation of a most fundamental human right, that to self-defense, the petitioners were asked, nay demanded, as if mere serfs by their lords, to relinquish equally fundamental rights of universal self-expression and security of person and possession. To redress grievances, people were threatened with violence against them if they didn't relinquish their rights. This slight, but one of an innumerable litany of other abuses by government, can be seen as nothing by anyone who wishes for freedom in a true sense, but an act of outright aggression. Indeed, such indignations and usurpations by state actors are as heinous as they are commonplace, and to continue to kowtow and appease to initiators of that aggressive force is neither righteous nor moral, nor any other than cowardice and abdication of principle. Anarchists, more than any other, have an obligation to defend that which they hold sacrosanct: freedom, liberty, and self-governance. Not just a right to do so, they are obliged. As beloved Irish aesthetic poet and playwright Oscar Wilde so perfectly stated, disobedience, in the eyes of anyone who has read history, is man's original virtue. It is through disobedience that progress has been made, through disobedience and through rebellion. Such rebellion is this, to chafe at the yoke of government so severely as to throw it off by forceful means equal to their own, is the most virtuous of all rebellions. For indeed, what can be said to be more virtuous than to be willing to lay down your life, your liberty, and your happiness, that others might feel the taste of true freedom and unadulterated liberty? This is, at its core, the end game of the Boogaloo, though it may come neither easy nor quickly. It is not a pretty way, nor indeed perhaps the most ideal, but it has become the morally necessary one, our hands forced by those who seek to steal ever more chance of seeing the goal by the day. Does maintenance of such a degree of novel freedom appear to anyone as if it will be easy or untrying? Am I saying this path does not end in what may be a greater recondite struggle to prevent a not insignificant group of incorrigible statists from relapsing into that same state of bondage from which they were only just freed? Not at all. But this is not the contention at issue here. And as such, we should eschew such debate, because with no doubt, even a paradigm shift within the attitude of the populace, one which I would argue we're already seeing, would find itself facing similar pitfalls. No, the rub here is that of not only the moral justification, but moral obligation of those who find freedom a hill worth dying on, to finally find it and to stand adamantine in righteous fury with barrels leveled, eyes focused, and teeth bared, to stand up and be counted by their loved ones, their friends, their neighbors, and make history forever the better, matching push with shove, coercive violence with equal defensive violence. We stand at a precipice. Below us, the seemingly inexorable fall to all-consuming, inescapable, and utterly destructive waters of despotism. Behind us, a barely contested, hard-scrabble climb to the glittering, lush, and fertile fields of emancipation and autonomy. That will be a brutal fight, and that cannot be overstated, but none has been so moral as surely no fight so great in scale of ambition has yet watered the parched tree of liberty.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right, passing it over to Dustin. You got 5 minutes for your opening statement. Begin whenever you're ready.
All right. So given kind of the state of the world and where we're at with the state and how they're moving to eliminate our freedoms every day, a lot of what I'm seeing is with the Boogaloo movement, basically a lot of people are they're justifying this through what they see as self-defense. And so when I started thinking about this, I really broke it down to what I believe to be anarchist principles, which are non-aggression, self-defense, and self-ownership, essentially. So I applied those concepts. There's more to it, but I think that with this topic, I think that's what I found to be most applicable. So I considered all of those items when going into this, and I found that personally it doesn't follow what our actual principles are. I can't agree that starting a war with the state follows non-aggression at all. There's going to be violations of people's rights when it comes to this, because war isn't an act of self-defense is never going to violate somebody else's rights. You're defending yourself, but you cannot violate somebody else when you're committing an act of self-defense. So my issue with that is that by calling for an open act of war, essentially, you will absolutely violate the rights of people. You'll trespass on their property. You'll end up killing people who haven't done anything wrong and who are not acting against you at all. In every war that you see, civilians die. And so if you're saying that that's the way that we should move forward, then you're saying that you're okay with killing people that haven't done anything that's wrong and they haven't violated you at all. I do agree that there is necessary action to take against the state, and I want to clarify also that I'm not nonviolent. Previous topics on this podcast, we were more about nonviolence, and that's definitely not where I'm coming from. And I'm not against self-defense either. That I want to make those two things very clear. That's not where this comes from. There's absolutely going to be the need for violence when it comes to gaining our freedom. The problem is that with anarchist principles, from the way that at least the way that I understand them, and the way that what I've put together as my belief system, is that we have the right to defend ourselves when we're being specifically aggressed. The state is aggressing against us in a general sense all the time, but to argue that you're being specifically aggressed at all times, therefore it's okay to seek retribution against any agent of the state at any time, it's just unreasonable, and it does not follow our principles as far as what I can see. There's a difference between having a gun to your head, I guess, and there's a difference between having a gun to your head and somebody threatening to put a gun to your head that is not even physically capable of doing so. The evidence for this really lies in the fact that people commit crimes every day and they don't go to prison for them, and they're not shot instantaneously. That's evidence that you can still act freely. However, there's always the possibility that, of course, that something like that can happen. So when the issue with that is, to me, is that when something like this happens, let's say that you decide that you're going to build a home, and you're not going to follow any codes, and that results in action from the state. That's the time that you need to defend yourself, and that's the time you need to call other people to help you defend yourself if that's the case. And that's how I personally believe that we have to fight the state, is we have to use self-defense, and we have to be true to the concept of self-defense. If you manipulate the definition of that to allow you to commit acts of war against people who are peaceful just to get rid of an oppressive regime, you're really doing nothing different than the state, I guess. And that's why I personally can't agree with it.
Awesome. Right under time.
I'll relinquish the rest of my time.
Awesome. Thank you very much. All right. So now we're going to move to the first point in here. And you guys kind of touched on this in your opening statements, so let's see if we can go a little deeper. Is an uprising a defensive action or an offensive action? And that's going to go to Andrew first. Is an uprising a defensive action or an offensive action? Why or why not?
I find the idea of an uprising to be a defensive action. The state, by the nature of being a state, can only exist through the use of coercive force. So, uprising against that is an uprising directly against the use of coercive force. This is no different than if a tyrannical local rancher in the Old West was terrorizing a town and constantly threatening to kill people, intimidating them, pointing weapons at them, implying that they were going to kill them, and causing them to live in constant fear. This a fight against that is a defensive fight. It is not an aggressive fight, it's a defensive fight. The aggressor is the one who initiated the aggression and initiated the force. All you're doing is responding to that. And whether that group of people that you're responding to are the mob or a local rancher or a big group of people in some ivory towers that call themselves government, all you're doing is pushing back.
All right. Plenty of time left here, and we'll pass it over to you, Dustin. I'll read you the question one more time. Like I said, you guys both touched on it in your opening statements, but I'll read it again. You have 5 minutes. Is an uprising a defensive action or an offensive action? Why or why not?
Okay. Is it all right if I touch on his points?
You
and
can
then
absolutely,
kind of just
yes.
Explain kind of how I feel further? Okay. Okay, cool. So I definitely more or less agree with the statement, honestly, that you made. I just think that what is important really is like thinking about the semantics, I guess, of what you're suggesting. In a general sense, I would absolutely support people defending themselves against the rancher in your example. If he's threatening to do them, the way that I would recommend doing that is just refusing to do business with that person. And if that results in violence against you, then you absolutely have the ability to defend yourself, and that would be full within your rights. The one and even if that takes a standing militia within your city to defend against that person, that's absolutely fine. Because I would be sure if it was a person with a lot of resources, they'd probably hire a security firm to back them up. So you'd want to do the same. For me, the part of it in terms of like an uprising that I can't support would be, for example, let's say you're putting together an army within your city and you're marching against a capital that's 1,000 miles away and essentially invading a city that you have little business being there, in terms of you're basically bringing war of your beliefs into somebody else's home. And those are the types of things that I would say absolutely do not follow anarchist principles. And that's the type of thing that not all people that I think are calling for this, but I think some people are. And I think that that's kind of my whole point of being here anyway, is really that I want to try to make the distinction that I definitely believe in defending yourself, but at the same time, you have to do it the right way.
All right. Moving on to the next question here, and this one's going to dive even deeper into what you just touched on, Dustin. So this came up in a thread that kind of sparked this debate. In the event of an uprising against government, are the people who are pro-government or not interested in the uprising being aggressed against? And why or why not, and how or how are they not? And that'll go to Andrew.
And this definitely ties in to Dustin's answer and a point that I wanted to address, which is the flaw in the logic is that if you are, say, responding to someone who has attacked you and you are responding to that in person, one person attacks you directly, they've shot at you and you shoot back, those bullets you cannot will to only hit your target. You can't will them, your shots to be perfect. So therefore, the fact that some people get caught in crossfire is not necessarily a moral dilemma, because that is something that is largely outside of your control in the nature of your response. And it's the same thing with a war. A lot of that is largely outside of your control. Because of that, the people who are trying to remain neutral, the people who are pro government but aren't fighting for the government, yes, things may happen that may damage their property. Things may happen that people may get injured. That's the nature of war. It ain't pretty. I've been, and it ain't great. So, yeah, that happens. Your goal, though, is to defeat your opponent, and you are not aggressing against anybody by intention, but the people that you are responding to, the people that you are using defensive force against. If that defensive force spills out, I can understand saying, well, you'll need to make recompense for that. You'll need to fix that. But I don't see saying, oh, you are an immoral person because you responded to coercive force and somebody else also got hurt inadvertently and unintentionally. You can't judge morality by hypotheticals and possibilities and what you might accidentally do. It should be judged on intent. Here, there's no intent for aggression. There's no targeting. If you begin to target civilians, then yes, they are definitely being aggressed against. If you decide that rather than trying to use a strategic missile, you're going to carpet bomb a city, yes, you have now aggressed against the people who live in that city. That's not okay. But if you're trying earnestly to not hit things that are not the aggressors, you can't really be entirely morally liable. If you're actually doing everything that you are doing, you can't be said to be an immoral person or committing an immoral act. You were doing everything you possibly could to avoid collateral, but collateral will inevitably happen. Explosions are big, they do a lot of destruction. Occasionally things will happen. And rest assured that the aggressors are not worried about collateral.
All right. Dustin, you can respond, or to Andrew's response to the question, or you can field the question. The question was, in the event of an uprising against government, are the people who are pro-government being aggressed against? Why not? How so? How are they not?
Okay. I think I'll just more or less respond. So the reason that I would argue that they are being aggressed against is because, I mean, like you had stated, you said that their things will be damaged, and even their lives may be taken. And so though you're saying their intent essentially is that you're trying to gain freedom, but the reality of it is that you're going to be violating people's properties and their lives. And the difference between the way that I feel that we should move forward with things compared to this type of solution is that this type of solution is in an open act of war, you're essentially marching across the countryside toward, in some nature, towards an objective, and you're going to essentially destroy all resistance in your path until you achieve that objective. You're going to obviously be targeting the people that you interpret as aggressing against you, but you're absolutely going to be destroying the property and taking the lives of people that are there and that want nothing to do with that, and that is going to be seen as an act of an aggression. And additionally, those people are going to absolutely have the right to defend themselves against you when they had no interest in being in this fight at all. They're going to most likely be catalyzed to do so. They were probably most likely on your side, and now you've turned them against you because of the fact that you've done what you did. My solution to this is essentially trying to expel all forms of that coercion at a local level, and that will take care of the problem at a local level, and then you have to move from there. The localities will be able to, if they all start doing the same thing, they're going to be able to band together and eventually have a defensive force that'll be large enough to end the state effectively. But marching across like a countryside to destroy your objective, it's just open act of war, and I can't see how that could possibly align with an anarchist principle.
All right, we're answering questions pretty quickly, so if you're interested, Andrew, you can do a or a first rebuttal to that, and then I'll pass it back to you, Dustin, if you guys want to do that one more time.
All right. Yeah, and I definitely do want to read about that. First of all, you seem to be under the impression that with the Boogaloo, you're going to have large armies, large groups of very traditional war, and that's not going to be what it is. That isn't what modern combat has been for probably 70 years. Um, it's going to be an insurgency, localized insurgency. No one is moving large amounts of people in any way appreciably different, most likely, than they do now. You're going to be using the existing roads, you're going to be using existing paths, and hopefully the majority of the people in your locality are on your side, because you are fighting for their liberty too. And it's the job of the people who are fighting to make sure that they are recruiting. That's something that I've learned in my various experiences in training, is how to encourage localized insurgencies and the locals in areas to join you, to support your cause. And we're not talking about just a giant, this isn't the American Civil War, this isn't the 1860s. We're not talking about a huge army that's moving as one mass. We're talking about small localized attacks, small localized engagements, probably nothing that lasts more than 10 or 15 minutes, most likely, because in asymmetric warfare, you get into a big shootout, you're going to lose. If you're the insurgent force, if you're the op for there, um, we're talking about small localized things. We're talking about small movements, and it's up to the fighters to remain true to their principles. And if they are going to move across a local person's property or utilize their property, to get their permission to request it and get it. In the case of if somebody, let's say they, to your point, let's say somebody, a group of federal troops sets up inside someone's house and begins shooting at you, and you now need to respond as an anarchist. If you're responding to that, well, you have every right to defend yourself, and you're not the one who placed a bunch of armed people in someone's house. They're the ones who chose to set up there and then initiate the aggression from there. They made it the target, not you. They're the ones responsible for that. You're responding directly to an imminent threat to your life. You can't be held responsible for what happens to that property. So I don't see a moral dilemma there. I don't see a moral dilemma in what might happen as a result of the fight, because again, it isn't a fight that's being asked for. It's a fight that was brought to us, and that's going to be the case in those engagements for the most part. Once they get past the initiation, it's going to be something very similar to what we've seen probably in Iraq and Afghanistan, where it's very local. It's the locals doing it. It's hit and run tactics, very small, limited engagements. Nothing huge, nothing big. That might happen eventually, but that's very unlikely.
All right, Dustin, would you like to respond once more, or would you like to field the next question?
I can go ahead and just field the next question, honestly.
Sure. Okay. So, in the event that the state is destroyed during an uprising, a Boogaloo, whatever you want to call it, are the individuals engaging in this Boogaloo or uprising responsible for the well-being of those who choose not to participate after the state is gone?
That's an interesting moral dilemma.
This one's going to Dustin, so yeah.
Okay. No, this is a good question, because this is actually something that came up. How this whole debate started, essentially. How we came to this. So I think that specifically, no, I'm not going to argue that. Like if all of these, if all all the people that are involved in the actual violent, like in the conflict itself, they're not going to be, I wouldn't argue that they're responsible to pay any type of, like, reparation or fix anything that they did or provide jobs or any of those types of things. I wouldn't argue that. I think where I think kind of where this idea was coming from is essentially because this was kind of a complicated, this is a kind of a complicated topic. But I think the issue is that essentially the reason that we have the government that we have now is because of the fact that there's a market for everything. Market dictates human behavior, not necessarily economic, but even conceptually. And so what the market in the United States is telling us for how we should run our country in terms of what the market wants is this is what is going to work for the majority of people, and they're accepting of that. Essentially, they're buying it. There's a lot of people like myself and I would, the two of you also that aren't, buying that, but we're not, our numbers aren't big enough to where we're effectively making that change through the market. And so I think this argument was kind of coming from the fact that the state has essentially created a system where they're still being able to survive, have jobs, all of this stuff. And if you take that away, you're taking that away from them, and now you're responsible for that. And I wouldn't say that I agree with that statement. What I think is important to get out of this is that we need to change the minds of the market. We need to change the minds of the people so that we can start moving towards having viable solutions post-state. I think I would say that our action needs to happen before, those things need to happen before violent action rather than after. And I think that's kind of where maybe that opinion came from.
Awesome. Andrew, would you like the question, a rebuttal? It sounds like we're all pretty much in agreement here on that part, but I'll read the question one more time and you can decide.
Well,
or you go for it if you're ready.
Oh, I was just going to respond.
Sure.
I think that it's a kind of a much more complex issue than I think initially might be apparent, because the question becomes, but especially the people who aren't aware yet, now you've taken away what they see as their only support system. I don't think that you're morally obligated to then pay for things or feed them, or unless you eat all of their food over the course of the Boogaloo, in which case, if you stole that all, you're responsible for replacing that. You took that. You owe them. But I think that, or if they agree to, set up for you to set up shop in a command base in their house, and then it gets attacked because you're there, I think maybe it's justifiable that you help them out with rebuilding that, because that wouldn't have happened if you weren't set up there. So you do bear some obligation to them. But I think more importantly, you bear an obligation to teach them the better way, to make sure that they understand and encourage them and help guide them. I think that is a moral obligation for you, because you've just taken away everything that they knew. You can't just abandon them. And it would be a bad decision to abandon them, because they're just going to go back to what they had before, because no one's shown them any different. Well, now you've removed every impetus against that change to anarchism. And, to Dustin's point where he mentioned there's a market demand, yes, but it's artificially created and sustained through coercive force, threat, an indoctrination program that lasts 12 plus years. These things it's not a true market. It's something that's been artificially created. And now you've smashed that supply for a market demand. It's kind of your moral job to help change that demand to something that's healthier. It's the same way as if you suddenly waved a wand and you did away with all opioids on planet Earth. Well, you did that. Now I feel like you're at least somewhat morally obligated to teach the heroin addicts how to get over their addiction and to help them out with that, because you took away what they felt like they needed, and they don't know what else to do. And that's your fault.
Absolutely. Excellent responses, guys. Excellent. So this next question is actually going to go even deeper into this and more during the timeline of a Boogaloo uprising, whatever. And this one's going to go to Dustin to field first again. And so this is focusing on people who are dependent on the state for survival. let's say benefits, state benefits, things like that, not infrastructure and whatnot, because I'm pretty sure most, if not all, anarchists agree that infrastructure can be better provided without a state anyways. So let's talk about surviving exclusively off the state. Are individuals who are whose survival is dependent upon the state justified in attacking those who wish to dismantle the state, and would their actions be self-defense?
This is a pretty challenging question morally, but I do like it. I think that if you're going to really talk about anarchist principles and do they really have the right to self-defense against you for fighting the state? I would say no. I don't agree that I think that they probably will. I think that they probably will absolutely fight against you, but I don't think that if you're going to talk about anarchist principles and is it okay for, is it actually a moral act in terms of what our principles are? No. Because of the fact that the money that they're getting is coming through coercion. The government is stealing my money and your money, and they're paying those people, so they don't have a right to that money. They're getting that money from the government because they made essentially a justification to the government about why they need it, and they need help. And so that's the current system that's set up. I think that it's realistically it's going to be on either that person individually, or if they're a person that can't make their own decisions or take care of themselves, it's going to be up to the people that that do that for them to find voluntary means to support them. It's not a nice thing to say, I guess, but I think if you're talking purely principle, I think that that's the reality of it. Those people can't sit there and say that I'm morally justified to kill you because you took my income away that was stolen from you. I guess that's where I'm going.
Sure. Andrew, do you like the question, rebuttal, or are you ready to respond?
I'm ready to respond.
Go for it.
I think that their response, if they did fight in support of that support, is understandable. That doesn't make it moral, but it means that I can empathize with them trying to protect what they see as their only means of survival. Knowing many people who are disabled and are on disability who legitimately cannot work. No one will hire them. They're too much of a risk. They can't get a job. They can't function normally. I understand why they would want to attempt to sabotage your efforts to essentially take away what they see as their only means of survival. I don't think that that's a moral act, the same reason that Dustin said, because it's stolen money to begin with. It was already taken through an act of coercive force, so it doesn't magically become moral because it was for a good thing, right? It's morals don't alter depending on situation, and I'm sure I'm going to catch so much flack now that I just said that, but I don't care, right? I'm a moral. I don't believe that morals are subjective. So they don't change just because, well, what else am I going to do? I do feel, though, that the same kind of thing as I said before. I think that anarchists, though, are obligated to just by duty to be kind of, keepers, their brother's keepers there. To a certain extent, they're obligated to try and help these people because that's how voluntarism works, right? You don't the argument that the reason that you don't need the state to take money from people to help those people is because people can voluntarily give if they care about those people. And I think that helping set those things up, giving them new support networks, things like that, is something you would be obligated to do because, again, you just ripped it away and they don't know what else to do and they aren't going to be able to figure it out on their own. I mean, if somebody has severe autism, they're not going to be able to go out and negotiate for contracts to go do things for somebody, right? They don't have that ability. the rest of their community is going to be obligated. The anarchists are part of that community, obligated to take care of each other because that's what we do and that's the right thing. And their defense of what they see is their only support system, although not moral, no, is completely understandable until you show them the better way.
Excellent. Very fair responses. Very fair. Okay, next one. And this one, you'll be having the opportunity to field this first, Andrew. We're flip-flopping back and forth. And so, is a Boogaloo uprising against government, whatever it is, an attempt to force freedom on those who don't want it? That was a very common theme in the discussion that kind of inspired this debate. So, is a Boogaloo an attempt to force freedom on those who don't want it?
Well, it can be seen that way. However, is doing something for yourself that also benefits them, whether they want you to or not, an immoral act? Is really the question that you need to ask for that. Because, you know, it is, if somebody is stealing from someone a whole bunch, right, and they don't want to stop stealing, they're breaking into people's houses, whatever else, and you're like, hey, I don't want to see you go to prison, and you set up better locks on everyone's homes so they can't get in anymore, was that an immoral act? You took away their ability to victimize other people. And I see this exactly the same way as that. All you're doing is taking away the victimization, whether they realize they're a victim or not, whether they realize, like, because if it's a kleptomaniac that's stealing from all these people, they can't necessarily help that. Like, they have an issue that they can't help it. Well, it doesn't mean that you're immoral from stopping them from stealing. And people who are statists are addicted. They have an issue. They are addicted to state power. They are addicted to the things that the state hands them. They're addicted to the theft that is happening. So while yes, you may be forcing them to be free, I don't see freeing slaves as something that is immoral, whether they wanted to keep being a slave or not. And after you've thrown off the yoke of government, if they want to go form their own little government commune off on the side and just do that in among themselves, I don't care. Go ahead and go back to it. Go do it. That's not my problem. As long as you're not aggressing against me and mine, I don't care. You guys can go do your little thing over there. But you know, that's certainly something you can do. It's the same thing as the economic debate with the anarcho-capitalists and the anarcho-socialists. And look, if it's a free society, it doesn't matter what you choose to do amongst yourselves. All right, your chosen economic model is irrelevant at that point. And it's the same thing here. If they want to go back to having a state, they can go back to having a state, but don't expect me to lie down if you try to come and aggress against me. So I think that it's force, yes, but I think it's a defensive force that they don't know necessarily that they need.
Very good. Very good. All right. Dustin, same question. Is a Boogaloo an attempt to force freedom on those who don't want it? Feel free to field the question or respond to Andrew's points.
Okay. So, I mean, if you're going to answer the question in terms of yes or no, I would say yes, of course. However, I think it goes pretty deep. I mean, you have to, there's a lot of factors that go into it. So I think that the part of this argument especially like with where all this came from, you know, the source of this discussion that we're having, what it really, the issue to me is specifically that because the state exists and we, you know, we're all participating in it. If the individuals that don't want involvement with the state, if we don't want to be involved with the state, our necessary defensive action should be dissociation. And then once you attempt to dissociate and you are acted upon aggressively, that would be your time to stand, essentially. And that's the argument that I personally follow. because that's going to essentially allow the people that want to participate in the state. It's going to let them do that. And it's going to give you the ability to assert your rights and stand for them. Because that's the most important thing. Rights don't matter if you don't stand up for them. You know, if you don't assert your rights, then you don't have rights realistically. You can say you have rights, but if you're not defending them, you know, it doesn't matter in real life. And so that's kind of where I see this. I see it's more of our responsibility as the anarchists to dissociate and then defend our position, rather than try to destroy the system and then tell them, hey, you know, I'm going to live my life how I want to live my life, and I'm going to do it in this peaceful manner that doesn't violate anybody. But and you can go ahead and live your statist life, but we're going to destroy your system first, and then you have the responsibility of rebuilding it, I guess. And that, I think that's where the difference in all of this comes for me, is I feel like when we're saying that you're forcing freedom on them, you are, and if they don't want it, you should just let them stay where they are, and we should just try to dissociate from that. And I think that that's going to be the best way to change the market as well. I mean, if you know, groups of, you know, large groups of anarchists started communing together to where they were actually capable of, you know, exerting significant defensive force, and they were living, you know, in a situation where they were trying to pursue black market avenues at all, you know, at all possibilities, to avoid things like, you know, sales tax, import taxes, things like that. Obviously, it's more or less impossible, you know, to not pay any tax at all. That's more or less impossible within the state. I think if you did your absolute best and due diligence to do it in every single aspect, and the state's going to come after you, obviously, especially if you have a large population, and then that's going to be your opportunity to stand. And then also it's going to bring light to your movement, and it's going to show the people around you that are not necessarily on your side really what it's about. um, and that's going to be the way to really sway the masses as well. So it's kind of like a multifaceted thing to me, I guess.
Excellent. All right. So we are catching up to our time. So I'm going to move on to the next question rather than offer a chance for rebuttals on that one. And this is one that came up today, kind of separate from what spawned this debate. I'll read the question and then maybe explain it a little bit if you need me to. But is an endorsement of violent action against the state automatically an endorsement of all ideologies' violent action against the state? So if you condone fighting back against the state using violent force, does that mean every ideology's idea of doing that is therefore justified? And that'll go to Dustin.
Could you maybe just is there any way you could try to clarify it for me a little bit further?
Absolutely.
Just so I can maybe provide a more specific answer.
Sure. Specifically, this came up in a discussion where the first party said that violent defense against the state is the only way in which they can be reasoned with, they can be ejected from your life. And another person said, well, if it's the only way, then all violent insurrections are also justified. Communist, state communist, socialist, whatever you have.
Okay.
So does one automatically qualify the other?
Okay, I gotcha. Okay, so I no, I do not believe that that is the case. The difference between you know, especially a principled anarchist, you know, withdrawal from the government, or you know, essentially a defensive revolution against the state. That is way different than, for example, like you know, overthrowing overthrowing a government to install like a dictator. That's not at all the same. And the reason, to me, at least from what I'm understanding from the question, is that, you know, we have our principles, and they're they're not aggressive. We're not violating people's rights. If you're overthrowing a government with the intent to do something like that, then that's absolutely a violation of the people's rights, and that's not that there isn't any way to defend that on a moral ground, I guess. And that's pretty short, but I think that's kind of what I got.
Not a problem. Very good. Andrew, did you need me to rephrase it or anything? You got it, or did I explain it pretty well for Dustin?
No, I think I got it. So as far as does logically endorsing anarchists overthrowing a state, does that logically mean that not then another state overthrowing a state is automatically moral? Well, no. Does it mean that a bunch of genocidal maniacs overthrowing a state was moral? No, because what makes an act moral is the motivations and the ends. And if you are motivated by I want to kill things just for the sake of killing things, or you're motivated by, oh, I want to install my own government. I want to, if your motivations are not defensive of rights in nature, then you cannot be said to be acting morally by, by actively initiating force against somebody who's got force against you. For instance, if a group of people is being genocidal, like look at say in Serbia, in Bosnia, Kosovo, the Serbs and the Bosnians, neither one of those was a moral force. They were both wrong, and in a violent revolution you can both be wrong, you can both be unjustified, both the government and the revolutionaries. There's no logical line between, well, I support this guy doing this for these reasons with these end goals. There's no logical line between that and, oh, this other person who has completely different reasons and completely different end goals is justified in the same action. Like if the action was shooting someone in the face and one person did it because that person was attempting to rob them at gunpoint, and another person did it because that person owed them money for drugs, that is not an equivalent action. Even though the action itself was the same, there is no moral equivalency between those two. They are not the same. Just because the act in and of itself is the same, there is no logical reason that by endorsing the one, I'm automatically endorsing the other. There's no convoluted syllogism that you could create that would make that flow. It just does not happen. I think that assertion that could even possibly be the case is absurd.
I agree with both of you. Excellent. So that brings us to the end of the questions. I'm hoping this was a more unifying debate, because it seemed like everybody agreed on a lot of points, and there were a lot of really excellent points made, guys. I really appreciate it. And since Andrew got the first word to start this off, you're going to kick us off into the closing statements, and then we're going to give Dustin the last word.
Well, I had a wonderfully prepared opening statement, not so much with the closing, because I know what path this is going to take. But what I do want to say in closing, though, is I still stand by my assertion that a violent act in response to the initiated aggressive acts of the government is moral. It is a moral thing to do. And while, yes, there may be things that could inadvertently happen that are not necessarily as moral, that are not great, that are not preferable, the beginning is moral, the end is moral, the act in between, as long as you are trying to stay as moral as possible and you are guided by your principles through the whole thing, I still see that as a moral fight, a necessarily moral fight the entire way through. And yes, it's going to be nasty. It's going to be terrible. It will be in your own backyards. And that's not a great thing. But we are also not the ones who started it.
Thank you. Over to Dustin for your closing statement.
All right. So in closing, I just want to say thanks for having me. First of all, this is really cool. And then also just, I mean, I'm still, I definitely, it was definitely good to get to actually see this point of view, like in a little more personal format, because I think this is probably one of the more reasonable ways to communicate. And I definitely can understand some of your points a little bit better. But I still as well pretty much stick to my original thoughts. Um, when it comes down to it, the only real rights we have in terms of violence are self-defense, and to me, self-defense is specific. Um, there has to be a specific aggressor and immediate danger, and that's the biggest difference, that I think that we're seeing in terms of our points of view is is people that more or less have a point of view opposite of mine are essentially saying that the state's oppression and aggression against the individual in a general sense is warranting immediate action and warranting specific action against specific individuals, when that individual may have never necessarily done anything to you. And that's where I have the biggest problem, honestly. That's where this really comes from. Um, if you're directly being coerced by an agent of the state, you should absolutely feel like you have the right, and you do have the right to defend yourself. But when you're acting essentially in open combat, or like even asymmetric warfare, um, any type of actions like that, you're going you're very well going to be kicking in the doors of people, of suspected state agents' homes, and probably assassinating them. And I can't agree with actions of that nature. Those types of things are specifically why I don't support these types of those types of beliefs. My beliefs are specifically self-defense against individuals that are committing acts against myself. Um, that's really what's in it for me. That's really the way I see it. Um, because if you kill an agent of the state who isn't specifically aggressing against you but is just living their normal life, um, you're holding them accountable for the actions of a concept of the state. You're holding an individual responsible for the actions of a collective, essentially. And I don't think that they're morally responsible for that. They're responsible for the actions they specifically take, no matter what their occupation is.
Excellent, guys. Thank you very much for coming on and making this happen. I was happy to host you guys here. Um, if anybody has an opinion, if your mind was changed, if you saw a winner or a loser, hopefully we saw unity more than either of those. Leave it in the comments on YouTube on this debate. Leave it in the comments on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever this goes up and you find the link. Once again, guys, thank you so much. Be sure if you have anything you want to promote since you were coming up on here. I know, Andrew, you do Anarchy Among Friends roundtable discussion and Weapons Wednesdays.
Yep.
And Dustin, if you have anything, I'm not sure if you do any shows or anything like that, but anything, maybe a friend's business, something, let me know, and I'll throw it in the description for this episode. I'll get all the links out to everybody. So, yeah, let us know what you thought. Everybody who is watching, this is YouTube exclusive. If you want to support the Podstash, you can see on your screen there, patreon.com/the Dank Pod-Stash. There's also a BitBacker. I'd really appreciate it. It helps make the show better and brings you back more content. All right. Thanks again, guys. Everybody, remember, total freedom, no exceptions.